Hey David, how are you?
Great. Thanks for having me here, Liza.
Oh, it's great to talk to you. I really love your documentary. It's fascinating, and I want to talk to you about it. But I want to show the trailer first, so people have an idea of what we're talking about, and
Sure.
what a great film it is. Um, where are you based? Where are you calling in from?
I'm in LA.
LA, of course. You're a filmmaker. So all right, here's the film. It's called The Story That Won't Die.
The story won't die.
Art can talk about politics, but politics can't ever talk about art.
I saw the effects of war on me when I started doing music and art.
I couldn't resist that temptation to scream against the whole history of Syria, against the whole establishment that is called Syria.
Luckily, I'm an artist, so I have space to use my memories.
Great. Powerful film. I loved it. I saw it at a screening you gave in New York a couple months ago. One of the quotes that you have there in the trailer is one that I pulled out before this interview, and it's art can talk about politics, but politics can't ever talk about art. I
Yeah.
love that.
Yeah.
Um,
From Tamam Azam, the
yeah.
Syrian artist.
How do you interpret that?
um, I mean, it's something I think we're seeing all over the world today, and obviously something I think that you know very well as a cartoonist.
Mhm.
Um, and I interpret it as art is about freedom of expression, and if you're working in art, you're working in the realm of freedom of expression, and politics can try to silence people and uh, as we've seen in Iran today, execute people and literally silence them. And as that happened, of course, in Syria as well. But if the artist is living in the realm of freedom of expression, politics can't engage at all. So I think in a way that's why maybe politics and politicians have been so afraid of artists throughout history,
Mhm.
is because there's truth, and they find ways to communicate truth and tell stories that are outside the realm of what can be quote unquote censored more traditionally.
Mhm.
Um, and for me, one of the exciting parts of this film, and of having been able to spend the time with these 8 different Syrian artists, um, is how they all uniquely found ways dealing with censorship, dealing with literal, physical, and also psychological, emotional limitations on the freedom of speech,
Mhm.
and yet found beautiful and inventive ways of expressing both their horror and their experiences after they left Syria. Um, so I don't know. It's an open-ended question. I've always liked the quote, and Tamam, the painter, Tamam Azam, who said that art can talk about politics, but politics can't ever talk about art, is such a wonderful, first off, brilliant artist and wonderful man.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
and I don't know, it sort of comes across in that line.
Yeah, I love his work. What I saw of it in the film, and I went and I think I followed him on Instagram. I just think he's amazing.
Yeah.
Um, so, what brought you to telling these 8 artists' stories? How did you get the idea, and what made you what motivated you to do it?
Sure. I made a film in 2016 called All These Voices, that won the Student Academy Award, about artists at the end of World War II, who meet an SS officer in a theater.
Mhm.
And by them doing their work, this Nazi, this opposition, the silencer of freedom, realizes his own lack of humanity. And it's through the art that he has this sort of ability to see the human on both sides.
Mhm.
Um, that same year, there was a short film called 4.1 Miles about refugees landing in Lesbos, Greece. And it I knew about the Syrian refugee crisis. This was 2016, so it'd been going on for 4 years, 5 years. But I think just seeing the sheer fact that this was the largest displacement of people since World War II really hit me. And of course, I got into that first short film that I was doing because my father was born a refugee, that my stories that I grew up with in my household were, how do you survive your siblings after surviving war? How do you document war? How do you preserve the memory of those we have lost? How do we keep our identity in the face of losing our people and living in strange and foreign lands? And what does exile mean? So these are themes that, when I was 4 years old, I wanted to recreate Cecil B. DeMille's The Ten Commandments. So I've always been sort of interested in the experience of being a refugee. And specifically my father, Alan Gerson, who was born in Samarkand and grew up in DP camps in Germany, was also an artist. And so the questions of how to use art to tackle these big, broad questions has just always been part of me. And so I just got really interested in who were the Syrians doing that? Who was sort of the Primo Levi of Syria? Who was the Picasso's Guernica of Syria, the Goya, the Bob Dylan? And that's how I started to meet some of these characters. I could go on for about 2 hours here, but not characters. I met Anas, for example, the musician who's selling his CDs on the beach of Lesbos with his band, who's an amazing artist in his own right, and is now making, he'll kill me for saying anything maybe, but making more melancholic, beautiful, sort of haunting songs of his current state of living in Germany after fleeing Syria. But he's also making sort of electronic, playful hip hop witticisms on Instagram that I love. So I met him, and I met Abu Hajar, the rapper in the film, and I met him through Aziz Al-Hamza, who we both know. Aziz, who was the subject of Matthew Heinemann's film City of Ghosts, who started Raqqas being slaughtered silently, who is documenting secret underground footage of ISIS in his town. And I guess I was very interested in how do you process using art, because that was my experience. He really opened me up to how do you protest using art, and introduced me to people like the rapper Abu Hajar and Diala Brisley, the animator, people who were doing more actively, who were really using their work early on in the protests to bring attention to what was happening in Syria. So it was sort of one by one, we met everyone, and there's the whole story.
Yeah, I have a couple questions in that regard. How did you choose these artists? And were there some that you left on the cutting room floor? And
Sure.
secondly, the narrative structure of your film is so great because you look at these artists as artists, and then the war happens, and you watch them deal with the war and how to process it as a creative person and how to talk about it with their art. And then you follow them to when they flee Syria and how they deal with, like, now what do I paint, draw, make music about? It's like, it's such an amazing, as somebody who's a creative person and the safety of the Hudson Valley, it's a fascinating thing to me to go through that process. So talk about your selection of the artists, and then also the paths that these artists went through.
There's millions of art. Look, there's 100 million refugees on the planet today, displaced people on the planet today, more than ever in the history of our Earth. Over 100 million. So within the broader refugee artist story, there are many brilliant artists that I have no idea about, and I'm excited to learn about, and I hope I get to learn more about. When we narrowed the film down to be focusing just on Syria, we started meeting people, and some were people who had, like Tamam, for example, has shown with Ai Weiwei, has been on CNN and BBC, and have received sort of public attention in that way, down to a breakdancer that we met on the side of the road in Greece, who we follow throughout the film. So everyone was sort of a different stage of their career. Some came from wealthy backgrounds, some came from very, very poor backgrounds, some came from religious backgrounds, some found religion to be an abomination after their
Was
experience.
that intentional to get that spread?
Yeah, definitely. And and look, I made this film very much in response. We have a previous president of the United States, you may remember him, and he was very anti-refugee, very anti-immigrant, as were many, would-be dictators and are around our planet. And as I was hearing rhetoric from that individual, I just kept really thinking about, who are these people?
Mhm.
I know who my father is. I know what my roots are. I know my family and my, but who are the people coming out of Syria, for example? And realizing they're just like, obviously, not all of them, but many are just like the people that I want to hang out with here in Los Angeles, the artists, the musicians, the filmmakers. And when you go into trying to tell a story, even if I have personal strands that I'm really looking for and digging for in every conversation that I did in this film. But if it's not exactly my experience of leaving Syria, I want to know, in this instance, who are the people who are really thinking about, how do I tell my story?
Mhm.
And the exciting thing for me is, as a director, is we got to speak with all different kinds of artists. So there's consciously thinking about different medium. We have dancers, we have also break dancers, and then we have like modern experimental choreographers and dancers. We have post-rock musicians and rappers. We have traditional painters and animators and experimental filmmakers. And it's sort of like all of the different creatives. And there were some amazing artists who we didn't include, mostly from the sake of logistics of just how many people's stories can you really tell, and not wanting to be exhaustive, and wanting the audience to have the kind of narrative structure you were speaking of, where you feel like you're meeting these people. You feel like, when you're at a party in Berlin, for example, you meet one person and meet somebody else, and slowly you're getting the whole story. That's kind of how this movie happened, and how we wanted it to feel as well, in that
Yeah.
kind of informal, intimate sort of way. Yeah.
Yeah, it was intimate, I think. It's not, you really feel like you're in the room with these people. I enjoyed that about your work. Did you run into difficulties in the filming when you were over there? Was any stories to tell there?
Well, I mean, we never went to Syria, first off. All of the footage of Syria is through the artwork of the artists, or through additional filmmakers' kind of B-roll footage.
Okay.
There's some from footage that's similar to City of Ghosts, that's part of Raqqa is being slaughtered silently, is footage of ISIS.
Mhm.
And there's footage from Talal Durki, the great filmmaker, from his films.
Interesting.
And so that's just some of how we captured Syria. The rest was on the ground in Europe, mostly in their studios. Mostly it's. I did my first documentary film about someone named Ultraviolet, who was Salvador Dali's mistress and Andy Warhol's muse and superstar in the factory, who became a born-again Mormon. And I spoke with Albert Maysles, the great documentary filmmaker, right before and right after making it. And he always said, don't do that annoying thing of putting talking heads. Film people as they really are. Well, unfortunately, I think Al probably would not be too satisfied with our film, even though we have a good amount of people just doing their thing. There is a good amount of just interview. It's not total verite filmmaking. There is some interview in there. And on those interviews, we just wanted to be as personal as possible, and just speaking as intimately as possible. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the interviews they're not like sitting in a room like a PBS film with a gray background. You're in the room with them, and
I mean, the benefit for us is we had a very, very small team. And that's a real benefit when you're trying to literally see, be in someone's college dorm room, which is, about the size of this room. You don't have too much flexibility. You don't have too much room. And also, though, this is a tightrope of a film to walk, in a way, because you one of my favorite lines in the film is Bahila Hijazi, who was one of the first all-female rock bands in Syria, part of one, and who says, "We're tired of being lab rats for documentaries." And here I am going to make a documentary about the creative process in a way, and telling your own story. And a big obstacle towards telling your own story is people like me coming in to tell that story as well. And yet, of course, you want to tell your story, you want your story heard, and yet it's tiresome. It's like, you know, a balance between the responsibility to tell your story and wanting to just live your life.
Mhm.
And that was a very tricky position to be in.
Yeah.
And I know from all of my conversations with everyone in the film, and from all of the interviews we've done afterwards and everything, I think the reason I was allowed into that room was because I wasn't so much looking for them as in full amount as for my own father, and for my own roots, and for understanding what is it like to live in exile. Because I grew up in Washington, D.C., so we went to the same high school, Sidwell, and didn't have the same experience of running for my life.
Mhm.
Nothing I could compare to it, really. And so that tightrope of walking a line and trying to understand something, but also not trying to make stereotypes or cliches, or put forward the same thing that's been put forward 1,000 times, is, even within myself, a difficult struggle, not to mention with the people that we're making this film with. So I think that was one of the biggest challenges on set.
How did you convey that to them? Did you speak openly about your father to them, or was it just how you behaved and approached it, came across to them as sympathetic?
No, I mentioned that in the first conversation. And certainly if I ever wanted to talk, like my grandmother, for example, I had my grandmother and my great aunt, both survivors of World War II, all of their family murdered, gassed, killed. One emerged totally religious, loving God and grateful for every day. And one emerged spitting at God and saying "feh" to God. So if I wanted to have that kind of conversation with some of the artists in the film about, well, how did your sense of faith evolve as you were on the run, I had to start with that story. And that became the conversation and sort of the opener to how we spoke about things. And then, in response, for example, Medhat Al-Dabal, who's a choreographer in Berlin, told me this amazing story, which is, I think, one of my other favorites of the film, that when he was on the side of the road with his friends after about a year traveling in Greece, and it was freezing, and he was cold, and they couldn't find someplace warm, and his friends all huddled next to each other, he said to himself, not, woe is me, but rather, okay, God is dead. I'm going to be my own God. I'm not going to be a victim, and I'm going to use these memories to make the greatest possible art that I can. And for me, like that's the lesson that I needed in making this film.
That's really great. I wanted to end with a quote that you have at the beginning of the film, that ties it back to your father, and it relates to what you just said. It's not what you think about a person when they are gone; it is what you create inspired by them. That's very hopeful, and that must have motivated you. You put it in the beginning of the film, so it's very clearly but your father's name was Alan Gerson, and he was a lawyer in private, in a practice that sued foreign governments in the U.S. courts for their complicity in terrorism, right?
Yeah.
Amazing.
Yeah. Actually, he changed the laws in the United States so that you could sue foreign sovereignties over acts of terror. And in fact, one of the reasons I didn't want to go to Syria is he had looked into suing Assad, which I never really brought up with anyone in the film before, but and so here's the end of our run, so we can get the secrets out.
You might have been in a little danger when you went. Is that what you're implying? Is that what you're saying?
there were multiple levels of danger. But it just, that wasn't the story for me. The story, you know, Syria is a very obviously it's the backbone of the story, and it's the culture, and it's the identity, but it's ultimately, as far as screen time, a very small portion of the film. And certainly the war in Syria is a very small portion of the film. This was not, for example, Retrograde, Matthew Heineman's film in Afghanistan. This is more about how do you process war down the line. Yeah, my dad died in the middle of making the film, or in the middle of editing the film. And those were one of his last lines to me before leaving the hospital. I told him, "Hey, Dad, I'm going back to California. I'll be back, you know, in a week." This was when he first went into the hospital. And he said, he stopped me, looked me right in the eyes, and he said, "It's not what you think about a person when they're gone. It's what you create inspired by them." And his clarity in the way he said that, he had a rare brain disease and was sort of fading quickly, really just stuck with me. And like you said, that's sort of Medhop's story. It's my grandparents' story. It very much was his story. And I guess in a way, it's becoming my story. And so that's really why I felt right to open the film with that.
Well, it's really a powerful film, and it speaks to me, you know, because of what I do personally, professionally. But I love it. So
I'd like to ask you, what does art can talk about politics, but politics can't ever talk about art? Me too.
well, let's do another interview sometime. But that's part of my job, is to talk about politics in my art.
Yeah.
It's funny, political cartoons have less and less power in this country, and that's a whole nother conversation. I just got back from Mexico, where politicians are bribing cartoonists to draw for their side. So we don't have that over here, up here. No. But that's another conversation.
Interesting.
Thank you, David. I really love the film.
I would
Everyone
just
go
say-
see it. What's it called again? The
Well,
story.
The Story Won't Die. It is, you can go to thestorywon'tdie.com or follow us on Instagram or Facebook or Twitter or wherever. And you can see the film now online in multiple places. If you just go to the website or Google the film, you'll find the easiest way for you around the world to watch the film.
Okay. Well,
And I should say, actually, on the website, if you want to learn more about the artists in the film, listen to their CDs, listen to their video albums, see where they're performing, go to their galleries where they're showing their work. There's a tab called Artists, and you can follow all the artists in the film.
That's great. Didn't know that. That's great. Okay.
Thank you for doing this.
Thanks again. You're welcome. I'll see you around.
See you next time.
Yep.